The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across Main Street as Willa Armstrong's heart sank deeper into her chest. Through the dusty window of Doc Miller's office, she watched the townsfolk of Independence, Colorado, going about their evening business, blissfully unaware that her world had just crumbled around her. "I'm truly sorry, Miss Armstrong," Doc Miller said, his weathered face a mask of practiced sympathy. "But there's no mistake. The fever you suffered last winter, well, it's left you unable to bear children." Willa's throat tightened as she straightened her back. At 24, she'd already survived more than most women twice her age, losing her parents to cholera, raising her younger sister alone, and now this final cruelty. "Thank you for your honesty, doctor," she managed, rising to her feet with as much dignity as she could muster. Her simple blue dress, mended in 3 places but immaculately clean, rustled as she gathered her shawl. "I'd appreciate your discretion in this matter." Doc Miller nodded solemnly. "Of course, though in a town like Independence, well, news has a way of traveling, and travel it did." By week's end, Willa felt the stares following her as she walked to her position at the town's general store. She heard the whispers, saw the pitying glances from married women with round bellies or children clutching their skirts. Poor thing. A woman who can't have children. Might as well be a barren field. No man will marry her now. Willa kept her head high, though each night she allowed herself the privacy of tears. Her sister Josephine, barely 18 and already being courted by the banker's son, was the only soul who offered comfort without judgment. "They're wrong, Willa," Josephine insisted as they sat by their small hearth. "You're the kindest, smartest woman in this territory. Any man would be fortunate to have you." Willa managed a sad smile. "That's sweet, Joe, but we both know what matters out here. Men want sons to work their land, daughters to care for them in old age. What use is a wife who can't provide that? There's more to being a wife than bearing children." "Not according to Independence, Colorado," Willa replied, staring into the dying embers. The following morning brought no reprieve. As Willa arranged bolts of fabric in the general store, Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Whitley entered, their conversation halting abruptly when they spotted her. "Good morning, ladies," Willa said pleasantly, as though she couldn't feel their discomfort. The new shipment of calico just arrived. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat. "Thank you, Willa. I hear your sister's engagement to young Mr. Holbrook may be announced at the Founders' Day dance." "Josephine is quite fond of him," Willa acknowledged, her fingers smoothing the fabric with practiced precision. "Such a blessing," Mrs. Whitley said, her voice dripping with suggestion. "To know the Armstrong name will continue despite circumstances." The bell above the door jangled, saving Willa from responding. All 3 women turned as Ethan Keller ducked through the doorway, removing his well-worn Stetson in a smooth motion that spoke of ingrained manners despite his rugged appearance. At 32, Ethan was something of a mystery to Independence. He'd arrived 2 years prior, purchased the struggling Cooper Ranch on the north edge of town, and kept mostly to himself except for necessary business. His cattle operation was small but growing, and he employed 3 hands who spoke highly of his fairness, if not his tendency toward solitude. "Ladies," he nodded, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who spoke rarely but meant what he said. "Miss Armstrong." "Mr. Keller," Willa replied evenly, noting how the women beside her suddenly straightened their postures. Ethan Keller might be an introvert, but his broad shoulders, strong jawline beneath 3 days' worth of stubble, and penetrating green eyes made him the subject of considerable interest among Independence's single women and their matchmaking mothers. "I need supplies," he said simply. "Making repairs to the north fence before winter." "Of course." Willa moved behind the counter, grateful for the distraction. "What do you require?" As she tallied his order of nails, wire, and tools, she felt his gaze lingering on her face. When she looked up questioningly, he didn't avert his eyes as most men would when caught staring. "Something else, Mr. Keller." A slight crease appeared between his brows. "You look tired, Miss Armstrong." The blunt observation, delivered without pity or judgment, caught Willa off guard. "Mrs. Patterson" made a small noise of disapproval at his directness. "How perceptive of you to notice, Mr. Keller," Willa replied, a hint of sharpness in her tone. "Your total is $4.23. He placed the money on the counter, then added an extra quarter for delivery. "I'm headed to the blacksmith and don't want to haul this back and forth." "The delivery boy comes at 4, she informed him. "That'll do." He nodded, replaced his hat, and with another general ladies to the room, departed as abruptly as he'd arrived. "Well," huffed Mrs. Patterson, "that man has the social graces of a grizzly bear." "But the looks to make up for it," Mrs. Whitley murmured, then caught herself. "Not that it matters to a God-fearing widow like myself." Willa wrapped Ethan Keller's purchases methodically, trying to dismiss the strange moment of connection she'd felt when he'd looked at her with those direct green eyes. It didn't matter. A man like him, with land and prospects, would want a proper family someday. And that was something she could never give. The Founders' Day dance arrived the following Saturday, and as predicted, Josephine's engagement to Thomas Holbrook was announced to general approval and celebration. Willa stood at the periphery, genuinely happy for her sister, yet acutely aware of the contrast between them, Josephine's future bright with promise, her own stretching emptily before her. "Aren't you dancing tonight, Miss Armstrong?" Sheriff Cooper asked kindly as he approached with a cup of punch. Willa accepted the drink with a smile. "I'm enjoying watching the happiness, Sheriff. Besides, someone has to keep an eye on the punch bowl to ensure Mr. Dawson doesn't repeat last year's whiskey incident." The sheriff chuckled, but his eyes held understanding. At 55, with a wife lost to childbirth years ago and no children, he perhaps knew something of feeling outside the town's expectations. "Well, if you change your mind, I believe I still remember how to waltz without crushing too many toes." As the sheriff moved away, Willa's gaze inadvertently crossed the room to where Ethan Keller stood against the wall, as removed from the festivities as she was. Unlike her, however, his isolation seemed entirely self-chosen. She watched as Isabel Miller, the doctor's daughter, approached him with clear intentions, only to retreat moments later looking disappointed. When Willa realized she was staring, she quickly averted her eyes, but not before noticing that Ethan's gaze had shifted to her. The intensity of his look sent an unexpected flush to her cheeks. The music changed to a lively reel, and Willa used the opportunity to slip outside for fresh air. The autumn night was cool but not yet bitter with winter's approach. Stars speckled the vast Colorado sky, offering perspective that sometimes eluded her within Independence's narrow confines. "Too crowded in there for you as well," Willa startled at Ethan's voice behind her. He stood a respectful distance away, his tall frame silhouetted against the light from the town hall. "I needed a moment," she admitted. "It's a joyful occasion, but sometimes others' joy can feel like salt in a wound," he finished, surprising her with his perception. She turned to face him fully. "That's an uncommon understanding for a man to express, Mr. Keller." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. "I've known my share of difficult days, Miss Armstrong." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of fiddle music and laughter. Willa found herself strangely at ease in his presence, perhaps because he seemed to demand nothing from her, not conversation, not explanations, not the brittle cheerfulness she maintained for the townspeople. "Your sister seems happy," he observed eventually. "She is. Thomas is a good man." "And you, are you happy for her or worried?" The directness of the question might have offended Willa from anyone else, but from him it seemed natural. "Both," she admitted. "I want her happiness more than anything, but she's all the family I have." "When she moves to Thomas's home after the wedding, you'll be alone," he finished. Willa nodded, unexpectedly finding her eyes misting. "Silly concern, isn't it? Most women my age have their own families to worry about by now." Ethan studied her face. "Not silly. Natural." He paused, then added, "I lost my brother 2 years ago. Influenza. He was all the family I had left. It's why I came west afterward, nothing holding me in Pennsylvania anymore." The personal revelation, offered simply and without self-pity, touched Willa deeply. "I'm sorry about your brother." "As I'm sorry about your circumstances, whatever they may be," he replied, his eyes holding hers steadily. "Loss comes in many forms, Miss Armstrong." Before she could respond, the doors to the hall burst open, spilling light, music, and revelers into the street as couples sought their own moments of privacy in the night air. The spell of their conversation broken, Ethan straightened and nodded. "Good evening, Miss Armstrong," he said, then hesitated as though wanting to say more. Instead, he simply touched the brim of his hat and walked away, his long strides carrying him quickly into the darkness. Willa watched him go, an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. It wasn't until she returned inside that she realized it had been the first conversation in weeks where she'd felt seen as herself, rather than defined by what she lacked. The weeks following the dance brought a harsh early winter to Independence. Snow piled in drifts against buildings, and bitter winds howled down from the mountains. Willa threw herself into preparations for Josephine's Christmas wedding, grateful for the distraction from her own thoughts and the increasingly direct comments from townsfolk about her unfortunate condition. One particularly brutal Tuesday, with snow falling so heavily the street was nearly impassable, Mr. Thatcher, the store owner, sent Willa home early. "No sense keeping open when nobody's fool enough to be out shopping," he said pragmatically. "Get home before it worsens, girl." Willa bundled herself against the cold and set out for the small house she shared with Josephine. The wind drove ice crystals against her face as she struggled through knee-deep snow, her progress painfully slow. She was only halfway home when she realized her predicament was becoming dangerous. The landmarks of the town were disappearing in the whiteout conditions, and the cold was penetrating her inadequate coat. Disoriented and increasingly afraid, Willa pushed forward until she collided with something solid. Looking up through snow-crusted lashes, she found herself staring at a horse's chest. Above it, Ethan Keller's concerned face appeared through the swirling white. "Miss Armstrong." He shouted over the wind. "What in God's name are you doing out in this?" "Trying to get home," she called back, her voice weak even to her own ears. Without further discussion, he leaned down from his saddle and extended a gloved hand. "You'll freeze before you make it. Come on." Willa hesitated only briefly before grasping his hand, allowing him to swing her up behind him with surprising ease. His body blocked the worst of the wind, and the heat radiating from him was immediately noticeable. "Hold tight," he instructed, and Willa wrapped her arms around his waist, too cold to be concerned with propriety. Instead of heading toward her home, however, Ethan guided his horse in the opposite direction. "My ranch is closer," he explained over his shoulder. "This storm's turning into a blizzard. We need shelter fast." The ride seemed endless, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. By the time they reached the sturdy log structure of Ethan's ranch house, Willa was shivering uncontrollably, her fingers numb even through her gloves. Ethan dismounted quickly and lifted her down, practically carrying her to the porch. Once inside, he deposited her near the stone fireplace where embers still glowed, and set about building up the fire with practiced efficiency. "Your clothes are soaked through," he said matter-of-factly. "You need to change." Willa hugged herself, teeth chattering too hard to form a coherent response. Ethan disappeared into another room, returning with a flannel shirt, woolen trousers, and a thick blanket. "They'll be too large, but they're dry. I'll step out while you change. There's a screen in the corner if you prefer." His tone was practical, without a hint of impropriety. When he returned several minutes later, Willa sat before the now roaring fire wrapped in the blanket, his clothes indeed swimming on her frame but blessedly warm. He carried 2 steaming mugs, offering one to her. "Coffee with a measure of whiskey," he explained. "Best thing for the cold." Willa accepted gratefully, the heat of the mug painful against her thawing fingers. "Thank you. I fear I might have been in serious trouble if you hadn't come along." "You would have been," he agreed bluntly, settling into a chair nearby. "Lucky I was headed to town for supplies before the worst hit." As warmth slowly returned to her body, Willa became increasingly aware of her situation alone in a man's home, wearing his clothes, with no chaperone and a blizzard raging outside. It was the sort of circumstance that ruined reputations in a town like Independence. Ethan seemed to read her thoughts. "Don't worry about your reputation, Miss Armstrong. My ranch hand Jenkins and his wife live in the cabin out back. She'll come check on us once the weather allows, and I'll send word to your sister as soon as the trail is passable." The thoughtfulness of this arrangement touched Willa. "You're very kind, Mr. Keller." He looked almost uncomfortable at the praise. "It's what anyone would do." "Not everyone would think of a woman's reputation while rescuing her from freezing to death," she countered with a small smile. His eyes met hers over the rim of his mug. "I've noticed you care what people think. Seems important to you." Willa stared into her coffee. "When you have little else, a good name becomes precious." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, casting dancing shadows across Ethan's austere but comfortable living space. Books lined one wall, surprising to Willa, who had never considered the taciturn rancher might be a reader. A worn armchair sat beside a small table stacked with volumes, clearly his preferred spot. "You must think me foolish," she said eventually. "Getting caught in a storm I should have seen coming." "I think you're human," he replied simply, "and humans make mistakes." The straightforwardness of his response drew a genuine laugh from Willa, the sound surprisingly light in the warm room. "You have an unusual way of speaking, Mr. Keller. So I've been told." His expression softened slightly. "My brother used to say I was allergic to unnecessary words." "Was he like you?" she asked gently. "James?" A true smile touched Ethan's lips for the first time, transforming his features. "Not a bit. He could talk the ears off a mule. Had a girl in every town we passed through when we were driving cattle up from Texas, but he was honest to his core." "You miss him very much?" It wasn't a question, but Ethan nodded anyway. "Every day." Something in his willingness to acknowledge pain without shame gave Willa courage. "The whole town knows by now, I imagine, but I learned recently I can't have children. An after effect of the fever last winter." She hadn't planned to share this, but something about the isolated cabin, the howling storm outside, and Ethan's quiet presence made the words emerge. Ethan's expression didn't change, didn't shift to pity or discomfort. He simply nodded once. "That must be difficult to bear." The simple acknowledgement, free of judgment, loosened something in Willa's chest. "It's not the children themselves I mourn most days," she found herself confessing. "It's the life that now seems closed to me." In a place like Independence, what man would choose a wife who can't give him a family? Ethan regarded her thoughtfully. A man who wants a partner more than a broodmare, he said finally. They exist, though they may be scarce in these parts. The bluntness of his assessment startled a laugh from her again. Mr. Keller, you really do have a way with words. A hint of color touched his cheeks. Apologies if that was crude. It was honest, she replied. I find I'm developing a taste for honesty these days. Outside, the wind continued its assault, but inside the cabin, a different kind of atmosphere was developing, one of unexpected understanding between two people accustomed to standing apart from others. As the evening progressed, Willa discovered that behind Ethan's reticent exterior was a man of considerable intelligence and surprising depth. He spoke of books they had both read, of his travels across the country, of his plans to expand his ranch into breeding horses as well as cattle. You've accomplished much in 2 years, Willa observed as he described the improvements he'd made to the property. Work fills the hours, he replied, then added more softly, keeps loneliness at bay some of the time. The vulnerability of the admission created a bridge between them. Yes, Willa agreed. I understand that strategy well. Their eyes met across the space between them, and something shifted in the air, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. The blizzard kept Willa at the Keller ranch for 2 days. True to his word, Mrs. Jenkins appeared the morning after her arrival, providing both practical assistance and the propriety of a chaperone during daylight hours. The older woman's presence allowed Willa to relax, and she found herself strangely reluctant when the weather finally cleared enough for Ethan to take her home. Your sister must be worried sick, he said as he saddled his horse for the journey. Josephine knows I'm capable of taking care of myself, Willa replied, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. Her sister would indeed be frantic. The ride back to town was conducted mostly in silence, but it was comfortable rather than awkward. When they reached the edge of Independence, however, Willa became acutely aware of the stares they attracted, a woman riding with a man, returning after a suspicious absence. Perhaps you should let me down here, she suggested quietly. For appearance's sake. Ethan's jaw tightened. Let them talk. There's no shame in surviving a blizzard. Nevertheless, when they reached Willa's small house and found Josephine rushing out to meet them, relief and worry mingled on her face. Ethan was meticulously proper in his farewell. Miss Armstrong, he said formally, tipping his hat once she was safely on the ground. I'm glad we could see you home safely. Willa smiled up at him, wishing suddenly that they were back in the quiet sanctuary of his cabin. Thank you for everything, Mr. Keller. Your kindness won't be forgotten. He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, then nodded once more before turning his horse and riding away. Willa Armstrong, Josephine exclaimed once they were inside. Do you have any idea how worried I've been? And then to see you returning with Ethan Keller of all people. The whole town will be talking by sundown. Let them talk, Willa said, echoing Ethan's words. He saved my life, Joe. Josephine's expression softened. I'm just glad you're safe, but 2 days alone with him, you know what people will say. Willa removed her borrowed coat, suddenly weary of concerns about appearances. I know exactly what they'll say. That poor Baron Willa Armstrong is so desperate she threw herself at the town recluse during a blizzard. It will provide entertainment for at least a month. Willa. Josephine looked shocked at her sister's bitterness. I'm sorry, Joe, Willa sighed. It's just, when I was there, none of that mattered. He treated me like a person, not a tragedy. Josephine studied her sister's face. You like him, she said wonderingly. He's a good man, Willa replied carefully. No, you like him, Josephine insisted, a smile growing. I don't think I've ever seen you look this way about anyone before. Don't be ridiculous. Willa busied herself with the stove. Even if I did, which I'm not saying, what would be the point? A man like Ethan Keller will want children someday. Josephine's smile faded. You don't know that. Not everyone. Please, Joe, Willa interrupted. I've accepted my situation. Let's not pretend it's something it isn't. But that night, as Willa lay in her bed, her mind kept returning to the warm cabin, to conversations by firelight, to the way Ethan's eyes had held hers with understanding rather than pity. It was foolish to entertain such thoughts. She knew, yet the memory of those 2 days stood like a beacon against the gray landscape of her future. The next week passed in a flurry of whispers and speculation, just as Willa had predicted. Some versions of events had her deliberately getting lost to trap Ethan into compromising her. Others painted him as a predator taking advantage of her vulnerable situation. The truth that he had simply been a decent human being helping someone in need seemed the least interesting option to the gossips of independence. Willa weathered it with as much grace as she could muster, though each day at the general store brought new innuendos from customers who thought themselves clever. Mr. Thatcher, at least, had the decency to shut down the worst of it when he overheard. Enough, Mrs. Daniels, he said firmly when the banker's wife made a particularly cutting remark. Miss Armstrong is the most honest employee I've ever had. I won't have her name dragged through the mud in my establishment. Willa had never been more grateful for her employer's gruff support. On Thursday afternoon, just as Willa was arranging a display of canned goods, the bell above the door jingled. She looked up to find Ethan standing there, looking uncomfortable but determined. Miss Armstrong, he said, removing his hat. I hope I find you well recovered from your ordeal. Completely recovered, thank you, Mr. Keller, she replied, aware of Mr. Thatcher and 2 other customers watching with undisguised interest. What can I help you with today? Ethan cleared his throat. I find myself in need of some fabric, for curtains. The request was so unexpected that Willa momentarily lost her professional composure. Curtains? Yes, he shifted his weight slightly. Mrs. Jenkins says the house needs softening. Understanding dawned. This was a pretext, but for what purpose? Of course, we have several suitable options. If you'll follow me to the fabric section. As they moved to a relatively private corner of the store, Ethan lowered his voice. I actually came to invite you to dinner, at my ranch, this Sunday if you're available. Seeing her surprise, he added quickly, Mrs. Jenkins will prepare the meal and she and her husband will join us. Everything entirely proper. Willa's heart fluttered traitorously in her chest. Mr. Keller, that's very kind, but considering the talk already circulating, I'm not concerned with talk, he interrupted. But if you are, bring your sister and Mr. Holbrook as well. His determination was both flattering and confusing. May I ask why you're extending this invitation? Ethan met her eyes directly. Because I enjoyed your company, Miss Armstrong, more than I've enjoyed anyone's in a very long time. The simple honesty of his answer disarmed her completely. In that case, she heard herself saying, I would be delighted to accept. The smile that transformed his face made her glad she'd agreed, regardless of what new rumors might emerge. Sunday at 4, then, he confirmed. I'll send the wagon for you. That won't be necessary. Thomas has a buggy, I insist, Ethan said firmly. The road to my property can be treacherous if you don't know it. As Willa watched him leave a few minutes later, having actually purchased fabric for curtains to maintain the pretense, she wondered what exactly she was getting herself into. Her practical mind told her not to read too much into a simple dinner invitation, while her heart, lonely and hungry for connection, whispered dangerous possibilities. Sunday arrived with clear skies and unseasonably mild temperatures, as though nature itself approved of the outing. Josephine was practically giddy with excitement as they prepared. "You must wear your blue dress," she insisted, pulling the garment from Willa's wardrobe. "It matches your eyes perfectly." "It's only a friendly dinner, Joe," Willa protested, though she'd already decided on the blue dress herself. With chaperones present, Josephine rolled her eyes. A man doesn't invite a woman to dinner at his home chaperones, or not if he's only interested in friendship. Especially not a man like Ethan Keller, who barely speaks to anyone in town if he can avoid it. "You're making too much of this," Willa insisted, even as she pinned her hair with more care than usual. "Besides, you know my situation. Even if he were interested, which I'm not saying he is, it wouldn't change the facts." Josephine's expression grew serious. "Have you considered that he might not care about those facts?" "Every man cares about those facts," Willa replied, the words carrying the weight of conviction born from 100 overheard conversations, a dozen pitying glances. "Not every man," Josephine countered softly. Willa was saved from responding by the arrival of Ethan's wagon, driven not by him but by Jenkins. This small consideration, sending someone else to fetch her to avoid further gossip, spoke volumes about Ethan's thoughtfulness. The Keller ranch looked different in sunlight than it had during the blizzard. Willa could now appreciate the care that had gone into its construction and maintenance. The main house was modest but solid, with a wide porch and the recent addition of a kitchen garden to one side. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, including a bunkhouse for the ranch hands and what appeared to be a newly constructed stable. Ethan himself waited on the porch, and Willa was struck by the transformation in his appearance. Gone was the rough work clothing, replaced by a clean black suit that, while not fashionable by Eastern standards, fit his broad shoulders handsomely. He'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his usually unruly dark hair. "Miss Armstrong, Miss Josephine, Mr. Holbrook," he greeted them with uncharacteristic formality. "Welcome to my home. Dinner was a surprisingly pleasant affair, Mrs." Jenkins had outdone herself with a feast of roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and an apple pie that drew appreciative murmurs from everyone. The conversation flowed more easily than Willa had expected, with Thomas drawing Ethan out on the subject of horses, a shared passion. Apparently, while Josephine charmed Jenkins with questions about his years working cattle drives. "You've done wonders with this place," Thomas commented as they moved to the sitting room after the meal. "Hard to believe it was nearly derelict when old man Cooper owned it." "It had good bones," Ethan replied. "Just needed someone willing to put in the work." "And money," Jenkins added with a chuckle. "Don't forget how much you spent on that new well and the irrigation system for the south pasture." Ethan looked slightly uncomfortable at this mention of his finances. A necessary investment. Willa, seated near the window, found her gaze drawn repeatedly to their host. There was something different about him today beyond the clean suit and trimmed beard, a nervous energy she hadn't noticed before, manifesting in the way he occasionally glanced her way when he thought she wasn't looking. As the afternoon progressed, Jenkins suggested showing Thomas the new breeding stock in the barn, and Josephine immediately volunteered to accompany them, ignoring Willa's subtle headshake of warning. "Mrs." Jenkins, with suspicious promptness, remembered bread rising in the kitchen that needed attention. And suddenly, Willa found herself alone with Ethan for the first time since the blizzard. "Your sister is not particularly subtle," he observed, a hint of amusement in his voice. Willa smiled despite her embarrassment. "Josephine believes romance is life's highest pursuit. She reads too many novels." "And you? What do you believe is life's highest pursuit?" The question was asked lightly, but his eyes were serious as they met hers. Purpose, Willa answered without hesitation. Finding meaning in one's existence, whether through family, work, or service to others. Ethan nodded slowly. A thoughtful answer. Most would say happiness. Happiness is fleeting, Willa replied. Purpose endures. You sound like you've given this considerable thought. I have, she acknowledged. Especially recently. A silence fell between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken thoughts. Ethan rose and moved to stand near the window beside her chair, looking out at his land. I brought you here for a reason beyond dinner, Miss Armstrong, he said finally. I wanted you to see this place, what I've built here, what I'm working toward. Willa's heart began to beat faster, though she cautioned herself against reading too much into his words. It's impressive, Mr. Keller, you should be proud. I am, he agreed, but it's incomplete. He turned to face her directly. A house isn't a home without the right people in it. The implication hung in the air between them. Willa felt her chest tighten with a painful mixture of hope and preemptive disappointment. Mr. Keller, Ethan, he corrected gently. I think we've moved beyond formalities, don't you? Ethan, she amended, the name feeling intimate on her lips. I think you should know that the rumors you've heard about me are true. I can't have children. If you're suggesting what I think you are, you should understand that reality clearly. His expression didn't change. I'm aware of your situation, Willa. It doesn't alter my feelings. It should, she insisted, rising from her chair to stand facing him. A man in your position needs heirs, sons to inherit your land, to carry on what you're building. What I need, he said quietly, taking one of her hands in his, is a partner, someone with courage, intelligence, and compassion. Someone who sees the world clearly yet still finds beauty in it. I believe I've found that person in you. Willa stared at him, searching his face for any hint of pity or compromise, finding only earnest certainty. We barely know each other, she protested weakly. I know enough, he countered. And I'm willing to take time to learn the rest if you'll allow it. People will talk, she whispered. They'll say you settled for less than you deserve. Ethan's expression hardened slightly. Let them talk. Their opinions matter nothing to me, and they should matter nothing to you. That's easier said than lived, Willa replied, though she didn't pull her hand from his. Then we'll face it together, he said simply. I'm not proposing marriage today, Willa. I'm asking permission to court you properly, to see if what I believe we could have together is possible. The offer was so unexpected, so counter to everything independence had taught her to expect from her future, that Willa felt momentarily dizzy with possibility. But years of practical self-preservation made her cautious. And if you change your mind, if someday you wake up regretting your choice. His hand tightened around hers. I'm 32 years old, Willa. I know my own mind. I've seen enough of life to understand what matters and what doesn't. Family can take many forms. Children can come into our lives in many ways if we decide that's what we want someday. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Willa felt the walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crack. You're sure? She asked. One final test. Instead of answering with words, Ethan leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was brief but conveyed a certainty that no words could match. When he pulled away, his eyes held a question. Willa took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a precipice. Then, decision made, she smiled. Yes, she said simply. I would be honored by your courtship, Ethan Keller. The joy that transformed his usually solemn face was answer enough to any lingering doubts. The following weeks saw Independence buzzing with fresh gossip as Ethan Keller's courtship of Willa Armstrong became undeniably public. He called for her every Sunday after church, brought flowers to her at the general store, and sat beside her at town gatherings. Some whispered behind their hands about settling and damaged goods, but to Willa's surprise, others expressed genuine happiness for the couple. "About time that man found someone," Sheriff Cooper commented approvingly one afternoon. "Been too much alone with his thoughts since he came to town." Even Mr. Thatcher, not known for sentimentality, gruffly told Willa she could have the afternoon off when Ethan invited her for a riding lesson. "Man's come in here every other day buying things he doesn't need just to see you," the shopkeeper observed dryly. "Might as well put him out of his misery and go for that ride." Not everyone was supportive, of course. The Sunday after Josephine's Christmas wedding to Thomas, Mrs. Patterson cornered Ethan outside the church. "A word of friendly advice, Mr. Keller," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "A man in your position should consider the future. Miss Armstrong is a lovely girl, but a wife who cannot provide children. Well, it's something to think about before things progress too far." Willa, standing nearby, felt her face burn with humiliation, but before she could move away, Ethan's voice rang out clearly enough for those gathered to hear. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Patterson, but it's misplaced. A marriage is more than a breeding arrangement. When I choose a wife, it will be for her character, her mind, and her heart, all of which Miss Armstrong possesses in abundance." The direct rebuke left Mrs. Patterson speechless, and as Ethan offered Willa his arm to escort her home, the admiration in his eyes melted away any residual embarrassment. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured as they walked. "Yes, I did," he replied firmly. "It's time this town understood that a woman's worth isn't measured by her ability to bear children." The courtship progressed steadily through winter and into spring. Willa discovered that behind Ethan's reserved exterior lay a man of deep feelings and thoughtful perspective. Their conversations ranged from practical discussions of ranch management. He valued her opinion on business matters more than she'd expected, to philosophical debates about books they'd read, to quiet moments where words weren't necessary at all. "You've changed him," Jenkins told Willa one afternoon when she'd brought lunch to the men working on fence repairs. "Used to go days barely speaking 3 words together. Now he's got opinions on everything from politics to poetry." Willa laughed. "I suspect those opinions were always there. He just needed someone interested in hearing them." "Maybe so," the older man agreed. "But it's you he wants to share them with. That's something special, Miss Armstrong." On a mild April evening with wildflowers beginning to dot the prairie around the ranch, Ethan proposed. There was no elaborate speech, no grand gesture, just the two of them sitting on his porch swing after dinner, his hand covering hers as he asked simply, "Will you marry me, Willa?" She didn't hesitate. Yes. The wedding was set for June, a simple affair at the small church in Independence. As the day approached, Willa found herself unexpectedly nervous, not about marrying Ethan, whose steadfast love had become the cornerstone of her life, but about the public nature of the commitment they were making. What if they ruin it? She confessed to Josephine the night before the wedding. What if someone makes a comment during the ceremony or whispers just loud enough? Then Ethan will probably punch them, Josephine replied practically, arranging Willa's wedding dress for the morning. And Thomas will help him, and so will I, wedding guest or not. Willa laughed despite her anxiety. "You're not helping, Joe." "Look," Josephine said, sitting beside her sister, "people will always talk, always. But the only 2 people whose opinions matter tomorrow are you and Ethan. Everyone else can go jump in the river if they don't approve." The morning dawned clear and perfect. Willa stood before the small mirror in Josephine's house, her home now, since Willa had moved her belongings to the ranch the previous day, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. The simple white dress with its delicate lace trim had been a splurge, ordered from Denver, but worth every penny for how it transformed her. "You look beautiful," Josephine said, carefully pinning wildflowers into Willa's upswept hair. "Ethan might actually faint when he sees you." "I've never seen that man faint in the face of charging bulls." "I doubt a bride will do it," Willa replied, though her cheeks flushed with pleasure at the compliment. When Thomas arrived to escort them to the church, his expression of genuine admiration boosted Willa's confidence further. "My friend is a fortunate man," he said gallantly, offering her his arm. To Willa's surprise and relief, the church was full. Not just with the expected attendees, Ethan's ranch hands and business associates, her friends from the general store, but with what seemed like half the town of Independence. Even Mrs. Patterson sat in a back pew, her expression inscrutable. Sheriff Cooper met Willa at the church door. "I hope you don't mind," he said, suddenly looking uncertain, "but Ethan asked if I would give you away. Said you might need someone to do the honors with your father gone." Tears pricked at Willa's eyes as she took the older man's arm gratefully. "I would be honored, Sheriff." "Jim," he corrected with a smile. "It's Jim today." As the simple melody from the church's wheezy organ began, Willa took a deep breath and stepped into the church on Sheriff Cooper's arm. The faces turned toward her became a blur as her eyes found Ethan standing at the altar, tall and handsome in his new suit, his expression transforming from nervousness to undisguised awe as he saw her. In that moment, the whispers and judgments of Independence fell away completely. There was only this man who loved her, just as she was, with all that she could and couldn't give. The ceremony passed in a haze of emotion. Willa remembered the warmth of Ethan's hands holding hers, the conviction in his voice as he spoke his vows, the unexpected gentleness of his kiss when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife. But what stayed with her most clearly was the moment they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Keller. Instead of the mixed or disapproving expressions she'd half expected, she saw genuine smiles, a few teary eyes, and then startlingly applause. It began with Jenkins and the ranch hands, spread to Josephine and Thomas, and soon the entire church was filled with the sound of congratulations. As they moved down the aisle together, Willa felt Ethan squeeze her hand. "See," he whispered. They just needed to be shown a different way of thinking. The wedding celebration continued at the Keller Ranch, where tables had been set up in the yard, and Mrs. Jenkins had outdone herself preparing a feast. As afternoon turned to evening, lanterns were lit, a makeshift dance floor created, and the ranch transformed by laughter and music. "I never imagined this," Willa confessed as she and Ethan swayed together for their first dance. "So many people celebrating with us." "People respond to genuine love," Ethan replied, his arm secure around her waist. "It's hard to argue with happiness right in front of your eyes." Later, as they circulated among their guests, Willa was surprised when Mrs. Patterson approached, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "Mrs. Keller," she said formally, "I owe you an apology." Willa blinked in surprise. "That's not necessary, Mrs. Patterson." "It is," the older woman insisted. "I said unkind things, believed unkind things about your situation, but seeing you two together." She glanced over at Ethan, who was laughing at something Jenkins had said. "Well, it's clear I was wrong about what makes a marriage worthwhile." The unexpected graciousness of this admission touched Willa deeply. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means a great deal." As the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Josephine hugged her sister tightly. "Are you happy?" she whispered. Willa looked over at Ethan, who was saying goodbye to the last of his ranch hands, his face relaxed with joy and perhaps a touch of relief that the public festivities were concluding. "Completely," she answered honestly. The first months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them, Ethan accustomed to solitude, Willa to managing her own small household. But they found their rhythm together with surprising ease, their complementary strengths creating a partnership that felt right from the beginning. Willa took over the ranch's books, discovering an aptitude for business that impressed Ethan. She expanded the kitchen garden into a productive plot that supplied not only their table, but provided extra produce to sell in town. Ethan, meanwhile, found that having someone to come home to transformed the ranch from a property into a true home. Their physical relationship, too, blossomed with tenderness and passion that deepened their connection. If there was ever a shadow over their marriage bed, it was only Willa's occasional moment of sadness that their love couldn't create the child that would have been a perfect blend of them both. But Ethan always sensed these moments and held her close, reaffirming that she was enough, exactly as she was. In their 7th month of marriage, as winter again approached the Colorado highlands, an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch. Ethan was checking fences on the north property when Jenkins rode out to find him. "Rider coming in," the foreman reported. "Young woman with a baby, looking mighty desperate." Ethan returned to find Willa on the porch, cradling a small bundle while a thin, exhausted-looking girl of perhaps 19 sat nearby, gratefully accepting the cup of tea Mrs. Jenkins had provided. "This is Sarah," Willa explained when Ethan approached. "She's traveled all the way from Kansas, looking for her brother who was headed to the gold fields." The baby in Willa's arms fussed slightly, and she adjusted her hold with natural ease. Ethan felt something catch in his chest at the sight of his wife with a child in her arms. "My husband died of fever before Peter was born," Sarah explained, her voice reed thin with exhaustion. "My brother's all the family I have left, I thought. I hoped he might help us." "And you've had no word of him?" Ethan asked gently. Sarah shook her head. "The last letter came from Denver, 6 months ago. I tried there first, but no one had seen him. Someone mentioned Independence." The hope in her voice was fading with each word. Ethan and Willa exchanged glances, a wordless communication passing between them. "You'll stay with us while we make inquiries," Willa said decisively, rising with the baby still in her arms. "You're in no condition to travel further, and this little one needs proper rest." "I couldn't impose," Sarah began. "It's not an imposition," Ethan cut in. "We have plenty of room, and my wife is right, you need rest before deciding your next steps." As Sarah was settled in their guest room, Ethan found Willa in the kitchen, still holding the sleeping infant with a look of such tenderness it made his throat tighten. "We'll send word to Sheriff Cooper," he said quietly. "If her brother came through Independence, Jim might know of it." Willa nodded, her eyes not leaving the baby's peaceful face. "She's at the end of her rope, Ethan. No money, no family. What will become of them if we can't find her brother?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had voiced aloud. Days passed with no news of Sarah's brother. Sheriff Cooper sent inquiries to neighboring towns, but the prospects grew dimmer with each passing day. Meanwhile, Sarah regained her strength under Willa and Mrs. Jenkins' care, and baby Peter became the center of attention at the ranch, his gummy smiles and curious eyes captivating everyone, especially Willa. Ethan often found his wife singing to the child, reading to him though he was far too young to understand, or simply watching him sleep with an expression that mixed joy and longing in equal measure. On the 10th day after Sarah's arrival, Sheriff Cooper rode out to the ranch himself, his expression grave as he asked to speak with Ethan privately. "I found information about her brother," he said once they were alone in Ethan's study. "Thomas Reed was killed in a mining accident near Central City 3 months ago. There's no mistake his personal effects were sent to the county office. No one knew how to reach his family. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of this news and what it would mean for Sarah and her son. "I'll tell her," he said finally. Sarah's grief was raw and devastating. She collapsed into Willa's arms when Ethan delivered the news, her body racked with sobs of despair. The baby, sensing his mother's distress, wailed in sympathy until Mrs. Jenkins took him to the kitchen, crooning soothing nonsense as she went. That night, after Sarah had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, Ethan found Willa sitting on their porch, wrapped in a blanket against the autumn chill. "What will happen to them now?" she asked as he settled beside her. Ethan took her hand. "That depends partly on us, I think." Willa looked at him, a question in her eyes. "She has no one, Willa, no family, no means of support. The baby needs stability, care." He hesitated, then pressed on. "I've been watching you with him. You love that child already." "He's easy to love," Willa whispered, a catch in her voice. "What if they stayed?" Ethan suggested, the idea that had been forming in his mind for days finally taking shape in words. "Not as guests, but as family. Sarah needs people to rely on. Peter needs a secure home, and we—" He squeezed her hand. "We have room in our lives for more love, don't we?" Willa's eyes filled with tears. "You would do that. Take on another man's family." "I would do that with you," he corrected gently. "We could offer them a home here. Sarah's young and strong. She could help with the house, learn to manage the accounts alongside you if she has the aptitude. Peter would grow up with fresh air, animals, and people who care for him." "Like a son," Willa breathed, hardly daring to voice the thought. "Like our son," Ethan confirmed. "If that's what develops naturally over time, we wouldn't be replacing his mother. Sarah would always be his mother, but children can have many people who love them." Willa leaned into her husband's strength, hope blooming in her chest. "Do you think she would agree?" "I think a mother who traveled hundreds of miles to find help for her child will consider any option that gives him security and love," Ethan replied. "But we won't press her now. Let her grieve first. Then we'll offer her a choice, not charity." When they finally approached Sarah with their proposal 2 weeks later, her initial reaction was disbelief. "You would do this for us? Strangers who arrived on your doorstep?" she asked, looking between them with wary hope. "Not strangers anymore," Willa replied gently. "And yes, we would. If you're willing to become part of our household, to contribute in the ways you can, we would welcome you both." Sarah's gaze moved to where Peter played on a blanket, babbling happily at a wooden horse Ethan had carved for him. "And my son, what would he call you?" "Whatever feels right to you," Ethan answered. "We're not looking to replace you in his life, but children benefit from many loving adults around them." "Aunt Willa and Uncle Ethan, perhaps," Willa suggested, though her heart yearned for more. Sarah studied them for a long moment, her young face showing wisdom beyond her years. "You can't have children of your own," she said finally, a statement rather than a question. Willa tensed but nodded. "No, we can't. And this isn't just charity. You truly want us here." "We truly want you here," Ethan confirmed. "Both of you." A slow smile spread across Sarah's face, the first genuine one they'd seen since delivering the news about her brother. "Then I accept with gratitude, and if in time Peter comes to see you as more than an aunt and uncle, I think I would welcome that. A boy needs many kinds of love in his life." The arrangement began tentatively, all parties adjusting to new roles and responsibilities. But as weeks turned to months, the unusual family found its rhythm. Sarah proved to have a natural head for figures, taking to the ranch's accounting with enthusiasm that freed Willa for other projects. Peter thrived in the stimulating environment, crawling and then toddling after Jenkins' dog, delighting in the horses Ethan introduced him to. falling asleep nestled against Willa's chest as she read aloud in the evenings. Independence adjusted to the unconventional family with surprisingly little comment. If some still whispered about the barren woman playing mother, many more observed the genuine love and harmony at the Keller ranch with approval. "Family comes in all forms," Sheriff Cooper remarked one Sunday after church, watching Peter toddle between Ethan and Willa, each holding one of his hands while Sarah chatted with Mrs. Jenkins nearby. "Seems to me you folks have figured out what really matters." By Peter's second birthday, celebrated with a small party that included Josephine and Thomas, now expecting their first child, the bonds between all members of the household had solidified into something unquestionably real. Sarah had blossomed into a confident young woman, running much of the ranch's business operations and developing a friendship with Willa that resembled sisterhood more than employer and employee. And Peter bright, curious, affectionate Peter moved between the adults in his life with complete security, calling Sarah Mama, and in a development that had first brought Willa to tears of joy, referring to Ethan and Willa as Pa and Ma. The first time he had used those names, Sarah had looked momentarily stricken, then relaxed into acceptance. "He has room in his heart for all of us," she observed that evening as they watched Ethan teaching the boy how to gently stroke a new foal. "I'm grateful for that." "Are you truly comfortable with it?" Willa had asked, concern creasing her brow. "We never intended to usurp your place." "And you haven't," Sarah assured her. "You've given us both a home and a future. If Peter sees you as parents alongside me, it only means he recognizes how much you love him." She smiled wryly. "Besides, when he's being particularly stubborn, it's helpful to have reinforcements." The arrangement evolved naturally over the years. When Sarah eventually married Jenkins' nephew Mark, who had come to work at the ranch, they built their own cabin on the property. Peter, now 5, divided his time between both households with the easy adaptability of childhood, equally at home with his mother and stepfather, and with the couple he continued to call Ma and Pa. And when Sarah gave birth to a daughter the following year, it was Willa who sat with her through the long labor, Ethan who paced nervously with Mark, and Peter who proudly declared himself a big brother, seemingly unbothered by the complex family relationships that might have confused other children. "We've been blessed," Ethan observed on their 5th wedding anniversary as they sat on their porch swing, watching the sunset paint the Colorado sky in spectacular colors. "In ways I never could have imagined when I first came to this territory." Willa rested her head against his shoulder, contentment filling her completely. "Do you ever regret it, choosing a wife who couldn't give you children of your own blood?" "Never," he replied without hesitation, turning to look into her eyes. "Not for a single moment. You gave me a family in so many other ways through your love, your partnership, your wisdom in recognizing that Peter and Sarah needed us as much as we needed them." "We proved them wrong, didn't we?" Willa murmured. "All those people who said no man would marry a woman who couldn't bear children." "They were wrong from the start," Ethan said firmly. "A woman's worth isn't in her womb. It's in her heart, her mind, her soul. Those who can't see beyond old notions of family and legacy are the ones missing life's greatest gifts." He pulled her closer, his arm strong and secure around her shoulders as Peter's laughter floated from the barn where he was helping Mark with evening chores. In the kitchen, Sarah was singing to her daughter, the domestic sounds creating a symphony of the home they had built together. "I love you, Ethan Keller," Willa said simply, the words carrying the weight of all they had experienced together. "And I love you, Willa Keller," he replied, his kiss sealing a promise that had proven stronger than convention, stronger than biology, stronger than the narrow expectations of a frontier town that had, in its own way, expanded its understanding of what made a true family. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Peter came running across the yard, his small face alight with excitement. "Ma, Pa, come quick! The new colt is trying to stand up." Ethan rose and extended his hand to Willa. Together, they followed their son to witness another small miracle on the ranch that had become the birthplace of their unconventional but utterly complete family. In the years that followed, the Keller Ranch became known throughout Colorado Territory not just for its fine horses and cattle, but for the family that called it home. Peter grew into a young man with Sarah's gentle spirit and Ethan's quiet determination, eventually taking over management of the ranch operations with a natural instinct that made his parents, all of them, beam with pride. The family expanded in unexpected ways. A pair of orphan siblings from a neighboring homestead found a home with them after their parents died in a fire. A young Ute woman fleeing an abusive situation was given sanctuary and eventually became Sarah's apprentice in bookkeeping. An elderly prospector with nowhere else to go was welcomed as grandpa to all the children. Independence watched as the concept of family was redefined before their eyes, and slowly, other unconventional arrangements began to take root in the community. Adoptions formalized, mixed-race marriages celebrated, households formed around bonds of choice rather than solely those of blood. And at the center of it all stood Willa and Ethan Keller, whose love had started as a defiance of convention and blossomed into a legacy that would endure long after the whispers about a barren woman had faded into distant memory.